It's difficult to think of India as its own country. It would be more appropriate to call it its own world in relation to the rest, as is true with China. Their size in comparison to everyone else is incomparable, even with countries whose populations are in the hundreds of millions. And most don't exceed 100 million, in fact only 13 of them do. The Philippines barely making the mark. These 13 countries house over 4.6 billion of the global population. So of the 233 countries and territories recognized by the United Nations, only 13 of them are home to over 60% of humanity. Then there are 14 with a population less than 100 million and more than 50 million. In between 50 and 30 million, there are 17. There are 42 in between 10 and 30 million. The remaining 144 all have populations less than 10 million, and if you combine them, they are just slightly larger than the population of the United States. In recent years, a handful of these smaller nations started to appear attractive on paper when considering some of their social programs. The Scandinavians in particular, Sweden being the largest of these countries with a population of 10 million, Finland, Norway, and Denmark all with populations smaller than Massachusetts. Although they currently have strong institutions of welfare generated from high rates of taxation, up until fairly recently, prior to the post-industrial age, historically they've significantly lacked in the development of new technologies and entrepreneurship. They've also benefited significantly from countries that have excelled in those spaces. What about a smaller, wealthier per capita country like Switzerland, that the United States recently tried to borrow the concept of compulsory health insurance from, ultimately demonstrating how cronyism in a much larger system can hijack and degenerate a well-intended program, creating more problems than solutions. Switzerland seems utopian by design. It's one of the wealthiest per-person countries in the world, with a recent GDP per capita of $80,000. It's a low taxation, affordable healthcare, high life expectancy, low poverty rate, high standard of living first world country. With a population of roughly 8 million, they produced $700 billion in 2017. The same amount the United States spent on the military the following year. And that budget is used to protect the interests of many allied European nations. So, they're wealthier per person, less bureaucratic due to a smaller body to govern, and don't share the same burdens as more powerful nations. The military is just one example. This is not to say that Switzerland has nothing to offer in terms of lessons from their practices. They definitely do. And at the end of the day, we have more similarities than differences. The point is to suggest the lack of efficiency in larger systems. The greater the population, the more difficult it is to mitigate their socioeconomic complications. It should be obvious that the size of a population brings about unique struggles, and if the country is poor on top of that, those struggles increase exponentially. So to get some perspective of India's size instead, it's a country 4 times the population of the United States, and 150 times the population of Switzerland. If India did everything in terms of policy and programs that Switzerland did, would their economy and living standards turn out to be the same? Perhaps over time, but it would have to be a great deal of time. With a country 150 times the population, the economy is currently only 3 times the size. And that wealth and the government power it influences is locked up into a very few small groups of people. If the largest company in India, Tata Group, took their 2017 revenue totaling $100 billion, note that's only 9% less than Microsoft made that year. If they gave all of that income to Switzerland, the wealth per person of one of the richest GDP per capita nations would expand another 14%. And that's just one company, which also turns out to be about 4% of everything India produced that year. Now what if Switzerland as a whole nation gave all of its revenue to India? On second thought, forget that scenario, since the impact would be so inconsequential it really isn't worth thinking about. Consider this instead. If the entire world, every country on the planet, took all of the money produced in 2017 and gave all of it to India, they would still be $15,000 a head shy of what Switzerland produced that year. Now this analysis has obvious weaknesses, since formulas such as the purchasing power parity couldn't even be assessed if a scenario like this were even possible. The objective is to stimulate thought, and focus one's meditation towards the fact that size of a population complicates things. It makes audits less accurate and bureaucracies less efficient, and presents a whole host of other obstacles to overcome. The endless list of obstacles that India has to overcome makes it the most challenging socioeconomic puzzle in the post-industrial era to solve. We just don't have an example to follow when it comes to dealing with all of their difficulties. So if we were to focus only on larger nations, which ones are actually successful in terms of economic stability and social progress, and which ones have not been able to make the mark? Of the 13 largest populations previously mentioned, only Japan and the United States seem to make it in terms of gross domestic product per capita and quality of living standards. Granted, the GDP per capita is a blunt instrument in understanding the wealth of a nation, but it gives us a basic idea of how much capital there is to go around on an annual basis. Who would come next in the population bracket? Most would guess China, but that's a matter of perspective. The country as a whole is one of the wealthiest in nominal figures, and if you separate certain regions from it like Macau, which is seated in one of China's 4 free market special economic zones, it would be considered the wealthiest nation per head. But the nation as a whole usually ranks in the 70s of the GDP per capita when adjusted by the purchasing power parity, and 5th of countries in excess of 100 million inhabitants. Russia is the 3rd with $26,000, and the next is Mexico with $18,900 per head. The rest are increasingly worse, ending with Ethiopia coming in last place at $1,900 a head. The question is, why is there such a small rate of success in these larger countries? We could add a few more to the list of successful nations, although in a slightly smaller bracket, such as the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and South Korea. A few countries whose population exceed 50 million, powerful countries with first world standards of living. How did it come to pass that these nations thrive while others struggle? And most do struggle regardless of the size of the population. One of the most compelling arguments to explain this comes from the 15-year academic venture realized in a book by Daron Ashmoglu and James A. Robinson, titled Why Nations Fail. The cover art of the text features a now famous location in Bombay called Dhobi Ghat. It's fitting for the cover of the project since it represents a method of the old which is still implemented today in a society that was left behind at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, failing to innovate or integrate technologies intentionally so that the wealthy elite were not challenged.
So for much of history, we thought that poverty is not an accidental byproduct of other things. It's actually created by design. That there are politically powerful actors, kings, monarchs, dictators, sometimes democratic politicians, sometimes business leaders, sometimes community leaders, who make decisions largely understanding, largely aware that this is going to create benefits for their group, for their supporters, for their cronies, and at the expense of others. And that's really at the root of the problem of inequality in the world.
It was not by accident that nations failed, but purposely by the elite in power. Although technology is now being embraced by the Indians, there is still a superior use of the labor force.
what makes a country move forward or any state is human resource capital. Anywhere in the world, it's human resource. Where are your innovations and great thinkers going to come? 60% of your people are tilling the land.
The fear of integrating new technologies in these societies is the fear by those in power of creative destruction. The new technologies will render the old system obsolete, and in turn render the elites that are in control of it obsolete. For a system to generate free markets and opportunities for creative destruction, power needs to be divided into the hands of many. The existing oligarchy must suffer a devastating event, and the elites must lose control of the governing forces. The point in time at which this opportunity arises is referred to by the authors as a critical juncture.
So the way that we describe critical junctures in the book is that they are periods during which existing institutions can no longer be maintained in their current way. And so that generates a sort of window of opportunity for change. It ranges from many things. It could be created by outside events. Those are the simplest ones. The Black Death, decimating the population of Europe and parts of Asia. International war. New technologies completely destabilizing the situation. But, it could also be, in many countries, the death of a leader or emergence of some new coalitions or a shock like COVID-19. So there are many of them, but they are still somewhat rare. It's not something that happens every year. And that's why when a critical juncture occurs, it is also an opportunity for those who could form a coalition or a movement or a political party to push for something better to take advantage of, because they're not going to occur every time.
The example they describe as the greatest critical juncture bringing about the first sustainable economy is the Glorious Revolution in Britain, 1688. The revolution would deteriorate the power of the monarchy and give power to Parliament and into the hands of the people. But in order for that scenario to take place, the monarchy had to already be weak. The genesis of that weakness was the second pandemic of the bubonic plague in the mid-14th century. It killed nearly half the population of Eurasia, with episodes in England lasting up until the late 17th century. As the plague devastated England and the resources of the monarchy depleted, Parliament began to organize and strengthen. Then, in the mid-17th century, Oliver Cromwell, backed by Parliament, overthrew and executed King Charles. He served as Lord Protector until his death, over which period Parliament became even more powerful and influential. When the monarchy was restored, Parliament called upon William of Orange to overthrow the monarchy once again, and a new constitution was established. The freedom of the people evolved to the point where most members of society had the opportunity for progress. Technology, education, and transportation began to advance at a rapid pace, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution. Creating a prosperous society with the most equal distribution of wealth and power in history. Everywhere where this model of society was replicated, those countries flourished with similar prosperity. Everyone else was left behind. Most were left behind. With an intentionally organized, unbalanced social structure that was put in place thousands of years ago, the exposure that England brought to India brought with it different consequences. According to the authors, there are two types of institutions that allow either a country to be prosperous or for its economy to stagnate, and the vast majority of its people to live in poverty. The institutions that ensure poverty are extractive institutions. Those that promote prosperity, inclusive institutions. And if there is one word which presents a solution to the myriad of challenges to the poor in all circumstances which will be addressed throughout this film, it is this word: inclusive. An extractive institution would be run by the rule of a small elite group, an absolutist regime. The majority of the members of this system are coerced to serve the state. Secure private property rights almost never exist in this environment. This includes land, branding, and ideas, and inventions protected by legal documents such as patents and copyrights. In an extractive institution, property is either owned by the state, in modern times such as North Korea or the Soviet Union, or by a small wealthy elite such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. Education is usually limited to a small group. Another key factor is the absence of free media. If people are well educated in an instance like North Korea or China or the Soviet Union, the people are limited in the knowledge they are allowed to obtain. From what is seen on the television and film, books, and the internet, everything is controlled. The more limited the individual is in a society and the less opportunity each and every individual has for prosperity, the poorer the country tends to be. Making those countries in which slavery has been a predominant presence in the population the poorest.
Of course, then they might find a way of justifying that through some ideological garb. But how else would you understand slavery? Sure, some slave owners in the US South before Civil War would tell you they were doing this for the good of the slaves, but slavery was ultimately about exploitation. And if you think that slavery was a historical anachronism, far from it. It is just one version of the same thing that has happened throughout history and even today. I mean, until it collapsed in 1994. The South African apartheid regime had much in common with slavery. It had, again, that had disappeared even before then, 1994, but it had a color bar that meant that black South Africans, more than 80% of the population, could not work in anything other than the most unskilled occupations. They could not become supervisors, they could not become carpenters, machinists, clerks, accountants, anything that really would give them an opportunity for social mobility. They were repressed, they were excluded, and this was not poverty of a huge population of South Africa that was created by mistake, but it was created by design. If you go to Egypt, if you go to North Korea, if you go to parts of Latin America, you see different versions of the same story, but it has much in common, and that's really what we had to understand, and that's why a lot of the arguments in the book are about the politics of poverty, because who controls political power, what they do with that political power, for whose benefits and at whose expense, those are the critical things we discuss.
The results of all these oppressive elements are intentional. It is the elite's fear of losing power to the possibility of creative destruction. Technology and advancement become a threat to the elites, so as they maintain their wealth, the people and the nation as a whole are left behind. The continuous cycle of this throughout time is what the authors refer to as the vicious circle. But there is also a virtuous circle.
What we define as inclusive institutions is an ideal type. is an ideal that no country ever has achieved. When we give examples of inclusive institutions, those are never perfect. That has to be borne in mind. But really, you should think of inclusive institutions in 3 layers. The first is economic, and that's very simple. We can talk about the details, but the big picture is clear. We define inclusive institutions as those that create opportunities and incentives for the people, not just for a few scions of the richest families, monarchs or dukes, not just for the cousins of the dictator or the military junta, but for the broad population. Opportunities, that's what we miss most of history. If you go back to South Africa under apartheid, that's an extreme case of no opportunities for 85% of the population. But if you go to US South, well after slavery had disappeared in the 1940s, 1950s, there are no opportunities for black Americans, and there are not even that many opportunities for white low-income Americans. So those opportunities have to be there. But then also you need the incentives that people actually grab those opportunities. So if you provide everybody good schooling, but then you don't give them any incentives because they can't succeed in business, they can't succeed in professions, they cannot succeed as workers, that's not going to work either. So those incentives and opportunities, they need to be at the heart of the economic system. And then we go through what are the things that would actually be best for generating such things. And the market economy is key, not an unfettered market without any regulation, but what we call an inclusive market, a market built on public services, public education, regulation of monopoly so that there isn't a power imbalance. But those sorts of market institutions are still key because the alternative to markets is central planning, and that's not going to create opportunities or incentives in any appreciable form. Then you need that inclusive economic institutions to be embedded in inclusive political institutions.
One needs to make sure that the other exists.
One needs to be there in order to be the basis of the other, whether that they are in positive synergy. And inclusive political institutions really are about the political analog of the same economic principle. The inclusive institutions fail when opportunities are monopolized, when money is monopolized by some groups. And political inclusivity fails when political power is monopolized by some groups. So that's why it's critical to have some sort of democratic institutions. It's critical to have some sort of checks and balances or constitutional rules so that whoever gets elected doesn't misbehave. That's why it's critical to have some state capacity, that the state is capable of regulating, enforcing law and order, and all of these things. But the third layer is really at the root of this, and that's really, we talked on this a little bit in Why Nations Fail, but it's the topic of our more recent book, The Narrow Corridor, that James and I wrote last year. And you really need political mobilization of the masses, that people need to be engaged in politics. They need to be part of the political machinery. They don't need to, they shouldn't just let politicians or elites or the learned ones to rule the country. So that sort of political engagement of the people is an important safeguard of these inclusive political institutions.